This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in Augustine's Confessions, Book 7. This is the second lecture in Book 7. And last time we were coming up to his discussion of the need for Christ in contrast to the Platonists, who he said didn't see that. And he uses he'd say the Platonists recognize God but not Christ. And it is because of sin that we need Christ, who, as the eternal God, becomes incarnate to share our nature and represent us on the cross. So he sees in the teaching of the Platonists something much better than the Manichaeans, who thought that substance was a physical thing, or evil was a physical substance. But they don't get him to Christ. And so the rest of this book is about that connection. How does he get there? So he reads Romans 1 as saying that although humans know God, they do not glorify him as God. Instead, their minds are darkened. And they exchange the glory of God for various idols, things in the creation that they put in the place of God. Romans is written by Paul, and in this book, the Apostle Paul, Augustine specifically mentions how it was in the Apostle Paul's writings that he came to understand what Christianity teaches and the unity of the Old and New Testaments. And so he says, God calls the Gentiles into faith in Christ. So how does this work? How do they exchange the truth of God for a lie? It could sound like they believe God is real and have the correct definition of God, and also say that something else is eternal. And this seems to just be a direct contradiction in their mind. And they might have that. Some people do just have direct contradiction. But what it sounds like instead, like they are in unbelief. They don't believe God is real, and they believe something else instead, even though this something else is demonstrably false. I worship this guy who's half human, half alligator. He's my God. You've seen him on the Egyptian pyramids. And Augustine mentions here specifically the Egyptian gods. And Egypt is one of the leading ancient civilizations. People might compete about which is the greatest, but it's certainly a leading one, and with its pyramids. And yet here they are, the height of human engineering, worshiping a guy who's half human, half alligator, or worshiping the sun itself. So he says what he wants, they came to want is to know what has existed from eternity. What made him? What is he? And this is part of the argument you can see. Truth does not take up space. Part of his proof for that there is something non-material. Truth is non-material. You can't say, I'm going to get a jar of truth later. I mean, maybe there's like some kind of kombucha that's named truth. I'm going to go get a bottle of truth. Well, that's just a metaphorical way of using the word. And, well, I'm going to go get truth. It's not a physical thing. So this is getting back to who God is. And he uses the Hebrew name for God. Yahweh, which is I am. This is who God said to Moses. Moses said, who should I tell Pharaoh sent me? And God says, tell him I am. What on earth does that mean? Not I might be, or I am, but won't be, or I wasn't, but am now. I am. God takes the name of the Eternal One, without beginning or end, changeless, infinite. None of the deities of Greece or Egypt are said to be like that. I mean, that's just not even contestable. Zeus had a beginning. He's finite. He's controlled by his lusts. The Hebrew God says this of himself. I am. So you're going to Egypt, to the height of human ingenuity, to a group that worships finite eternals, and they pay big bucks to go see movies about these guys. And you'll tell them, I am, thank you, the highest being. That's who Augustine wants to know. I mean, why would you settle for a lesser one? You know the highest being himself, the one who made all things. And so then he considers changeable material world. It isn't eternal, but it does exist. It stands in relation to God as God is the source of its being and therefore of its goodness. God doesn't need Augustine, but Augustine needs God. So he comes to this realization after his time in Manichaeanism. He comes to understand that being is good. To be is good. In creating, God determines the nature of things, and this is good. What is evil for a thing is what is contrary to its nature, what destroys what it is, so that it no longer is. So you think about that in any analogy you want. The human body, just a body. What's harmful to it is what breaks it up so it stops existing. Right? And a big part of that is death. Because once you die, you start to decompose really fast. So a cancer is growing on your liver. We say, well, that's harmful to you. It's good for the cancer, but no one argues that point. No one says, well, what about cancer rights? Because we know, well, it's harmful to the human body until it no longer exists. Or a car. We talked about a car in a previous lecture. Putting water in the gassing of a car would destroy the engine. So what's good for a thing is what's according to the nature of that thing. That's what we're looking to figure out. What is according to the nature of the thing? And so evil is not a fixed substance that's dark, as the Manichaeans thought. It's the corruption of whatever has been created. So he says, so long as something exists, it is good. And that evil then, whence I sought where it is not any substance. If it were a substance, it would be good. So how can we know that God made all things good? Well, Augustine gives an argument. God, in giving them being with a nature, made them good. So it's interesting, you might have an additional problem, and you do have an additional problem in Augustine. Then you have a corrupted nature. The corrupted nature is evil in that it brings about the destruction of one's nature. However, if someone's born into the world having that corrupted nature, they might identify with it and say, well, that's just who I am. When it's really something that's harmful to them. Say they have anger problems or something like that. Say, well, that's just who I am. Instead of saying, no, that's a corruption of your nature, of what you were made to be. You weren't made to be that way. So we have these two things going on, which is going to get us into, in chapter 8, a conflict between our nature and our corrupted nature, which interestingly wants to survive. It wants to exist. So it's in mortal combat with the original nature. This is the true mortal combat. It wants to pull the spine out of its enemy and say, what would it say? Perfect battle, something like that. What? Perfect battle, whatever it was. Yeah. I'm thinking here about the original. There might be like 20 renditions since then. I don't know about it. So the corrupted nature is evil, but it's at war with the other nature in one person. So this is not like the duelists, Plato and the chariot with two horses, because he's saying to be is to be good. And it's not that you're trying to get away from one kind of existence to another kind of existence, away from matter to spirit. It's that you're trying to be what you were created to be. And then he gets back to the works of God. The works of God in creation reveal their creator. And he goes through a list of them. In existing, they are praising their creator. This is very different than fleeing from the world to go to heaven. Talks about the birds of the air, the beasts, the trees, praising God. And all humans, from the greatest to the least, praising God just by existing. It displays the handiwork of God. And in his own life, he describes how unbelief worked. Part 20 here. He believed there were two eternal substances and did not believe that only God is eternal. After going through arguments to find out that evil is not of substance and truth is not material, he came to understand God the Creator. So why didn't you see it sooner, he asks. He gives the example of a piece of bread that to one person is appetizing and to another is not. Same bread. And I mean, it's an allusion here to the bread of life, not just a loaf of bread. How can someone turn away the bread of life? Well, it would be to their own misunderstanding of what it is. And so he says, evil iniquity or evil as not a substance, but a perversion of the will. Perversion of the will. It begins to will things that aren't actually good for it. So take the case of gluttony, where you have high cholesterol, and that can lead to plaque on the artery, which can lead to a heart attack. So, well, why did I go into that? Well, there's this problem of the will, and this is one of the things like this is one of three problems that arise for Augustine. This I'll note with you. One was his low view of reason that led to fideism, I mentioned in a previous lecture. Two is this one, his view of the will, even after having gone through how it's unbelief. That's the problem. That's the alternative, unbelief. He ends up on the will. And then third, which we'll get to, is his what's called the beatific vision, which is still that Greek otherworldliness. Leave behind the creation of God and float up to heaven, where you'll see God forever. So his problem has what he calls carnal custom, habit. He keeps going back to the habits that he's cultivated. But let's use his own analysis to think about these. He cultivated them because he thought they would do him some good. Even when he comes to say they don't do good, they're harmful, this doesn't remove his other beliefs. There's a tension in him of beliefs about the good. Belief and unbelief in conflict. So that's what we'll see in Augustine. That's what we've seen so far, and that's what we're going to see going forward. So his idea that you could just tame the will, that his sexual appetite just needs to be tamed through a stronger will, doesn't get him back to this tension, which he just, in the previous part, he just analyzed. But he doesn't seem to apply it here. But the conflict is one of belief and unbelief. And I think people give that a light pass because they'll say, oh yeah, I know this habit's bad for me, but I can't stop. And they're just not analyzing this sufficiently. if it's a free choice, then why did you do it? And the answers are things like, I gave in, which is so to avoid suffering. I wanted to feel good. You're pursuing pleasure. Any version of those, right? Both of these are similar in that you avoided one kind of suffering, but you may have incurred another kind you never thought about. And that's the problem. Unbelief. You hadn't thought about it. You put yourself in a situation where you have these bad habits now, and you didn't realize how harmful that would be. Or I wanted to feel good. Yeah, you're making pleasure your goal in life, not pursuing what is truly good. So again, that's unbelief. You don't know what you should know. So he says the invisible things of God are clearly seen in the things that are made. The creation reveals God. So that unbelief is without excuse. He's quoting here from Romans. Book of Romans is in the Bible. And he gives somebody of an argument here for this. For God's existence, from the changeable world to the unchangeable creator. The changeable world addresses to the unchanging, and the unchanging is our creator. That which is, remember that name given to Moses, I am. So that's a curious one. I put this question to you earlier. What good does knowing what's eternal do for anybody? It may not have ever increased anyone's pocketbook. And yet, if we define what is good, it turns out that knowing what is eternal is your highest good. Increasing your pocketbook isn't. It might actually be harmful for you. You'll use that on too many frappuccinos. Those have, I think, a bad combination of fats and carbohydrates, right? Which is, in combination, could be unhealthy if taken in large doses. You can get like a little thimble-sized frappuccino. No, I want the megaton frappuccino. Is that one of the sizes? Grande, Venti, megaton. Probably something like that. So here's the question he asks next, which kind of carries him through the end. How can we enjoy God? He had been rejecting God all his life in unbelief. As he came to see this truth about himself and the reality of God, he then puts together why he needs Christ. And that he goes through a couple of versions here, which you may not be familiar with, heretical views of who Christ is. Christ is the eternal Son of God, incarnate, fully God and fully man, having a body and a soul. Human soul. So we contrast that with a view called Apollinarianism. It says Christ was a physical body, but just had the divine pushed into it. So this is what we call the Orthodox view of Christ, small o. Eastern churches, Roman Catholics, and Protestants would agree on this. One of the things that they all agree on. Christ is the mediator and redeemer of lost humanity. Not simply a great teacher who points the way to God. We don't need that because we have the work of creation. So we can figure it out ourselves. We don't need a great teacher. What we need is one who represents us as sinners. That's what he comes to see. For all of the Platonist speculations, they didn't come to understand who Christ is. And so he says in part 25 that before he just thought of him as a great teacher. Some really good ideas. And he throws in here the virgin birth as one of the things that moved him for the following reason. Virgin birth is not simply a miraculous event to make Christ stand out, but it means that he is not in the line of Adam, the seed of the woman promised in Genesis 3. He will do what Adam failed to do and undo what Adam did. So that's the importance of this. Not just like, wow, that's really cool. Or a virgin. I hadn't heard of that before. And then some scientists will come along and like implant something and say, well, this baby's born of a virgin too. Well, yes, but not really. Put together pre-existing genetic material from a male and female and then implanted it. So here you have the one who represents humanity, which Adam was supposed to do and failed to do. That's much different than a great teacher or a miracle worker. So he comes back again to Romans 1, the invisible things of God revealed in the creation. And he confesses this. He had thought he knew, but he did not know. He thought he knew, but he didn't know. What he thought he knew was actually vanity. And so here he mentions something, the beatific country. The blessed country. And we will need to see how he developed that. So part 27, as I said earlier, he mentions in part 27 that he is finding the books of the Apostle Paul to be particularly helpful, and that he needed to both behold God and be healed by God. It would not be enough to just have some information about God. He needs to be healed. And again, continuing, remember the book's name, The Confessions. He continues, for thou art righteous, O Lord, for we have sinned and committed iniquity and have done wickedly. And thy hand has grown heavy upon us, and we are justly delivered over to that ancient sinner, the king of death, because he persuaded our will. The sin of humanity was that they were persuaded by the king of death. Persuaded is more than just the will. It means they were presented with an argument and they agreed to it. In this case, you will not die. Why? Because you will be as God. They had to believe that they, who are created, could become like the eternal one, who had no beginning. The they here is Adam and Eve, the original temptation. So they're persuaded, and that reveals their unbelief. And in this condition, remember the bread, he said, there's bread, but someone doesn't want it. The bread of life. In this condition, not only did humanity not recognize Christ, they killed him, which is a revelation of the depth of unbelief. If people speak that way, they'll say, oh yeah, if I just had a miracle worker come to me, then I believe. Well, no, you'd be the same as they were originally. They had those done, didn't believe, and it isn't just that they ignored him, gave him a job at some place out in nowhere where they could keep him out of the way, killed him. So here he's going from, think about his trajectory here. He's gone from his own unbelief, wrestling with arguments about dualism and Platonism, to affirming God the Creator and his own sin of unbelief, thinking he knew when he did not know. And from there to why he needs Christ, not just more information, but why he needs redemption. And you're going to pick up more on that same theme in book 8, dealing with struggles of his will and these habits that we mentioned already.